We're here, and there's a lot of things in this world that seeks to consume us, and one of the biggest things that seeks to consume us is going to happen on Tuesday, um, and it vies for our attention. It vies for our anger and our passion and our to put labels on other people, and yeah, just things that have gone through my life recently. They just weighed on my mind this week, and so I couldn't think of anything else. And I think part of it's because in the section that we're talking about in Matthew, it's how to care for the family, but it's how to care for the human family. It's the family where we all begin in it. We all begin in the kingdom of God, and as we've been considering for the past few weeks, babies and children, they live these vulnerable lives, and they're wired by default to see grandeur and enchantment in the world around them. It's like, I don't have my own kids, but I've seen the babies where I'm like, I am a hand. And like, it's just enchanting. And the things that we take for granted, the things that lose a special meaning to us. The baby and the kids, they're discovering it all. And they can dream big, they can love big, but at some point, life happens to us. And pain threatens to destroy our enchanted view of the world. But Jesus has come to re-enchant the world. He's come as God like no other religion ever viewed God. In other religions, humans were annoying. They were slaves to do the work that the gods did not want to do. They owed glory to the gods. And so the gods created humans so that way they said, I create these people to bring me more glory and I'm gloried. Jesus re-enchants the world with a God unlike any other. And Jesus re-enchants the world with a God who is even unlike the God of the people who claim to be gods. They didn't recognize him because he wasn't like the God they thought. And God before our eyes, he ends up being vastly different from how any human had conceived him. He's vastly different in how much better, how much more loving he is, how much more willing to get in the dirt with us he is, to sweat and bleed and just live life. He talked about how for 30 years he lived amongst his neighbors. And when he said, I'm God, his neighbors said, you can't be. This isn't who God would be. You'd be a champion. You'd be the elite. You'd be rich. You'd be powerful. All the things that I dreamed to be. Jesus shows a God who's deeply connected to us, and he's God as Jesus is he's mind-blowing for those who held themselves to be experts in God. God, as they understood him, had to be separated from the problems of the world, lest he consume us with his holy fire. And God, as the experts had understood him, had to be appeased, and patience had to be bought by the spilled blood of something, or else he'd spill our blood. Up to Jesus, there was not much distinction from the economy of the God who finally comes as Jesus and the economy of any other gods. All the economies were drenched in blood. To save our skin, the First Testament says that God had to be blocked off, away from us in a type of holy Fort Knox. As if physical, literal walls somehow actually protected God from what we're doing and hid him away from us. No, as much as the walls were pictured to be there for God's sake, along with the sacrifices and all the other stuff, what we find is that when we truly get to know God in Jesus, we realize how much of a farce everything else was. How much of a farce it sounded like that somehow a cloth curtain kept a supernatural, all-powerful being from witnessing what's going on out there and kept his rage contained to this little room so he wouldn't kill people. And what we realize in Jesus is that all of that was there for our sake, so that we could picture it as if we were divided from God and safe. You see, here's a picture that's painted at the Exodus. If you go to I think it says slide number 5, Solomon. See if we get up there. There we go. It says, now, therefore, if you hear my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you'll be special. You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Moses, go tell these words to the Israelites. God tells Moses, if you listen to me and agree to work with me, I'm going to make you a nation of priests, and we're going to change the world. Israel responds. See if I can control this now. There we go. Israel responds. Sounds great to us. Let's do it. The people answered as one. They all said, everything that the Lord has spoken we'll do. Let's do this thing. Let's be a nation of priests. There's many details on what we're going to cover and what I've been thinking on over this last week that we can't all fit into the day, but we're going to hit the highlights. And so Moses brings the people to the mountain where God is. Why a mountain? Mountains were seen as places where heaven and earth connected. And in the ancient world, they understood that at the top of the mountain, that's where the gods lived. It's the place where their world and ours was believed to meet. Why would gods live anywhere else? God's really everywhere, as we've come to understand. He's not limited to our physics. But yet, God also gave them an experience of meeting him there. God met them at the place where they understood God would be. God met them within the confines of what they could understand at the time. And they perceived God to be just where they thought he would be, and just how they understood God's to be. He was big, loud, and scary. So they draw back and they remove themselves from God. They came, they were ready, and once they see how big God is, they're like, well, let's back up. They draw back while God instructs Moses on the 10 Commandments. When Moses and God wrap things up, Moses comes out to where everybody's withdrawn to. And the people tell Moses, we've changed our minds. You go speak to God, and then you speak to us, and we'll hear you. But don't let us listen to God again. He's scary. The people were offered direct access to God, and they accepted it at first. And then when they experienced it, they turned it down. Moses tries to tell the people not to go this way. He says, people, don't be afraid. God has come only to test. And in the Hebrew, this word test is also to give you the experience of, or to educate you. Or he's going to educate you on how big he is, and gain respect from you so that you respect what he's telling you to do and you don't sin. Essentially, Moses is saying, everybody, don't be afraid. Come back. Let's keep the original agreement. But the people remain far off. Make sure I'm still on the right slides. Yes. The people remain far off. Then the people stood. Really, they stayed. They were already at a distance. Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Tons of cool stuff to look at. But what we have time for today is the word for then. The word for then is also the word for but, and I think I have the wrong slide up there. Let me go to the next slide. There we go. Again, I love technical difficulties. No, we're on the right slide. So we have then the people stood at a distance, and the word then here is also the word for but. And so the flow here is that Moses says, people, no, let's go to God. Moses encourages them. And basically, the verse starts with, but the people stayed at a distance. Well, Moses went up. And we read in the next verse that God says, thus, you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves how I spoke with you from heaven. The word thus right here, it means henceforth, from now on, from here on out. And it signals a change based on what just happened. In other words, as the people have pulled back from the first plan, and they've refused to respond to Moses' encouragement to approach God again, God's saying, okay, well, from here on out now, let's change things up. I will meet the people's demands, which is now they demand they don't meet with me face to face. God is now responding to the people's new insistence that they will not have direct relationship with God. So now God was put into place a system of indirect relationship. God is telling Moses here, well, now, based upon their choice to hold a distant relationship with me now, here's what you're going to tell them. And things change. Moses is to tell the people, you saw how God spoke to you directly from heaven. In other words, God did what he said he was going to do. But you guys weren't. God kept his end of the deal, but the people are unable to keep theirs, so they keep a distance. They demand a distance. So God gives into their demands. He meets them where they are able to meet. And when they meet God face to face, they realize we're not able to meet him there right now. So the next verse, God says that in their distancing from him, based upon the fact they need an intermediary, they tell Moses, you be the intermediary because we don't want to see God face to face. God says that in their distancing from him, that they're not to connect him with any silver or gold image. Okay, you can distance from me, but don't put something in my place. Don't create a gold or silver image. Don't use something to resemble me because you heard directly from me. You know I'm not that. Don't make that. So he says, don't make those, but he makes provision for how they understood separated relationships with God to be. In the ancient world, sacrifices stood in the middle of people and their gods. Sacrifices were a buffer. Sacrifices absorbed the anger that was coming from my God to me, and they buffered me from that. Sacrifices took my gratitude to God, and it went into the sacrifice and it carried it to the God. Sacrifices were this buffer. So God says, we'll have some sacrifices. You don't want to have direct relationship with me, we'll have some sacrifices. Of the altar, though, God says, it is good enough to simply pile up some dirt and place your sacrifice there. We see a lack of grandeur in God that is still being snuck into what the people have demanded. God says, you can make the altar of sacrifice you're demanding. You can make this thing you want to put in between us. When you make it, just know that I only need dirt. And you can just go ahead and toss the sacrifice to me onto the dirt. Dirt altars were common in the ancient world. No matter how impoverished someone might be, they can make a mound of dirt. Or they can gather up some stuff that's nearby, and it can just, the poorest person could make one of these altars. But dirt altars weren't the best. But God says, it's good enough for me. It wasn't the best, though, according to humanity. Ornately carved and crafted altars of rock, it was so much more prestigious. They're beautiful. Let's get some marble rock and let's make an altar that looks amazing. But God is saying here that dirt's good enough for me. God goes on to say, but if you want to make me an altar of stone, don't build it out of hewn stones. These are crafted stones. Don't chisel them and think that you're making them more beautiful than they already are. If you use a chisel on the altar, if you use a chisel on these stones, you're profaning it, you're defiling it. God passes to the people through Moses, basically. If you want to make me a stone altar, that's okay. But you defile the altar if you think that dressed up rocks is of more value to me than simply the rock. As God responds to the people's demands, it's recorded that he sneaks in that the dirt is good enough. If you feel like you need to do more, stone's okay, but leave it as it exists. That's good enough. There's a glimpse of a God who's not fancy and high demanding. He doesn't say it's only good enough if you clean it up before you bring it to me. He doesn't require us to make something that he made and try to improve on it for it to be of more value to him. In fact, as we think on this, in our endeavor to make something more accessible to God, to buy into the idea that God's evaluation of something depends on us making it better. What we see in this is that God says, to think that way ruins what you otherwise sought to do. Just approach me on victories. I approached you where you were and where you understand on a mountaintop with no formality from my end, no demands. Jesus says as much about ruining things by trying to make them more ornate and more value than they just are as God created them. Jesus says as much when he speaks to us of coming to him based upon how ornately we have lived our lives. When we come to Jesus and base our value with him upon how much value we believe we have added to ourselves, Jesus says, he's going to tell that person, I never knew you. Jesus turns everything ornate about me away. Look how pretty I made myself for you, Jesus. I don't know this pretty person that supposedly thinks they're more value. Jesus turns everything ornate about me away until I come to him and say, well, I guess here I am. I'm kind of a plain pile of dirt. I'm a pretty rough rock. And Jesus says, there you are. That is who I know. I didn't know the fake you that tried to front to me as if you were someone else. This is who I knew. And God saying to leave the altar stones just as they are, and God not declaring a stone altar sacrifice to be of greater worth than a dirt altar sacrifice. In God's accommodation of the people who drew back, God is working here with intrinsic value. The dirt has intrinsic value. That rock that you want to pick up, it has intrinsic value. You don't add to it by making it prettier and somehow making it more meaningful to me. We often take our value from how we exist, not simply that we exist. And when we're exposed to treatment that establishes our personal value upon how we exist, our worth gets thrown off. God works off of the value of pure existence, so that my worth to him at my worst is no less to him than my worth at my best. My usefulness to things, my experience of things, that may vary between my best and my worst. But my value doesn't change. So that as we come into Matthew chapter 18, what we read is that Jesus uses two types of metaphors to speak of two different types of human beings. He speaks of the children to refer to those who are in relationship with the loving God, as we all start life, and as many of us continue life. And then he speaks of the kids who've been tripped out of faith. They've been so tripped up by pain and hurt, I can't believe in a God who's love anymore. And then he uses the second metaphor. It's those who are sheep now, who are in the divine flock of God. They're in faith with a loving creator. And then those sheep who have been tripped up or tricked. We saw that the Greek word means deceived, out of the flock. They're now disoriented, and Jesus called them the lost sheep. But Jesus tells us not to hold the lost sheep in any less worth than the sheep that's still in the flock. And the question that underlies that section in Matthew 18 that we've been looking at with the sheep is that if a sheep gets lost, the question that underlies it is, so are they no longer a sheep? The answer is no. And Jesus' point is exactly how they exist, either in the flock or lost in the woods of life somewhere, it doesn't change their value. The value they hold is anchored to their existence. We struggle with this because often the feedback we receive in life, it leads us to view our worth in our own eyes and in the eyes of others as a sliding scale based upon my successes and my failures. Valuation in our culture is generally not established upon the fact that I simply exist. And positive feedback is minimal, if at all, for the value that I hold simply as I breathe. I was recently in an adult-styled event where I sat with a family who did bring their kids. This event was an adult-level conference, but this family brought their kids, and these kids were well-behaved, barely a peep out of them. And after the event, someone came immediately over and poured out praise to the parents and the kids for how they existed at the event. And that person even mentioned another table of kids with their parents who had not existed so nicely, according to this person. The term that was used here was how precious your well-behaved kids are. Precious being a value term. And the term was not given to the other kids. These kids were taught your value came from how you existed here. With no recognition of simply, we love all the kids that existed here. In the Army, I've had a similar experience. I've seen soldiers told to demonstrate how they are not a waste of oxygen. Do something to show me why you don't waste oxygen. And they're conditioned that their value is not simply in their existence. Their existence, they are conditioned to believe it has a negative worth when it's neutral. And it sounds funny, but some soldiers were humiliated and forced to carry around a plant in order to replace the oxygen they were consuming. And therefore, they could at least then be a neutral presence and not a drain on the oxygen of this earth. It's a humorous image. But what happens when the condition is horrendous? People are conditioned, consciously or unconsciously, that their value is tied to what they are doing, how they are existing. Those people will be thrown into turmoil when how they exist goes through ups and downs. In one moment, I exist as a success, and my value then is high and it soars. In the next moment, I make a mistake, and now I exist as a failure, and my value crashes with it. The steady anchor is a value that simply is connected to my existence, that I've been created to exist. Is the anchor of personal value. And if we do nothing else but exist, our intrinsic value remains. God sees us intrinsically, and that's why from the cross, Jesus could speak forgiveness to his murderer. Their value to Jesus did not rest on how they existed in the moment they were murdering him. Their value was in that they existed at all. And who they took their existence from. You can hear the kids come back in a second here. But as I've seen people's value denigrated for how they are existing. It's a great exercise to look here and for God to say, don't touch the rocks. The value is not in how those rocks exist. The value is in that those rocks simply exist. And that you need to use them to get some space from me because I'm a little scary for you right now. Use them. But I won't let you fall into the mindset that by making a rock pretty, you make it anything more than the rock that it is. So use the rocks as they are. As we face an election this week, as mudslinging goes back and forth, as labels are thrown back and forth, and as the value of people is trampled underfoot, I think what's just been on my mind this week, as I see the news headlines, is to refocus on the intrinsic now. The value that when someone wakes up breathing today, they're worth something.